With a wealth of stories about heroes, superhumans, gods, people of incredible skill and power, you have to wonder how much we want human characters who persevere with human struggles to achieve something great, or godlike characters of near perfection who happen to have a few human flaws. Hello, welcome back. This is going to be a little more opinion based than my standard videos and a little more rambling, although I hope it will lead towards something a little more analytical. We'll have to see. Murder mystery, crime, giallo, that sort of genre is a massive thing, ranging from thrilling, sometimes horror-based films, to comedy, to very relaxed daytime TV. The types of characters you find in these stories do vary greatly, as they do with any genre. Like, sure, it does have its tropes based mostly in film noir days of gruff, alcoholic men who make gruff one-liners vaguely in the direction of any woman who happens to use a cigarette holder, but everything naturally varies. Nonetheless, I'd like to talk about a certain type of trope that does, I think, increasingly crop up, particularly in murder mystery stories, although obviously not exclusive to them. That trope is the genius, or the near flawless genius, I suppose. It's basically the protagonist, or sometimes not the protagonist, because the protagonist is a less intelligent, more relatable lens through which we view the genius, but either way, a main character who has such jaw-dropping intelligence that we as the audience can only be taken along for the ride in awe at their brilliance. The clearest example for this would be the BBC adaptation of Sherlock, where he runs off into half monologues or silent montages of deciphering evidence at lightning speed, all filmed and edited in a brilliantly satisfying way that does really make it work and is a big part of what made the show so iconic, but it's also a trope that causes other issues. We see Sherlock is brilliant in these deductions, we enjoy seeing his brilliance, but do we connect to it? I mean, well, no. Obviously we're much more connected to Watson, observing Sherlock's brilliance and being astounded by it, but how much emotion is there for us to the experience of just being astounded all the time? Hercule Poirot, probably the other most famous fictional detective who, again, genius beyond the likes of any other characters in the series of books, films, TV shows, games even. Poirot tends not to have these lofty monologues of thinking like Sherlock does. Instead, he tends to make some short comments about his little grey cells, asking questions quickly to himself, and then kind of, but not quite, voicing the answers he reaches. His inferior sidekicks of Hastings or Japp or whoever are normally left a bit dumbfounded and in the dark as to what Poirot has figured out, as we are too, the audience. Poirot will say something like, "Aha, mon ami, it seems the answer reveals itself to me if only I remember the broken vase," and you're left intrigued, like, oh, what about the vase? What has Poirot realised? I want to find out where this leads. And we often have to wait until it's revealed in Agatha Christie's powerfully satisfying big reveal at the end of the book, where Poirot gets all his suspects into one room and now has his big monologue to lay everything out he unearthed from the case, and we go, wow, it all comes together now. But until that moment, we are a little in the dark. Maybe not if you're intelligent enough to have already worked it out, but I'll be honest, I never try to work it out. Knowing these characters are portrayed as such geniuses, I don't know, I just kind of tend to slump back into a passive state and just enjoy the story. Or maybe reflect on some of the meaning to extrapolate and the emotions of the characters, but I tend to leave the actual investigation to the detective. This could be conjecture and bias, but I think I do that more so when it is a character whose intelligence is placed so clearly above my own. Whilst the whole mystery does need to make sense and be understood by us as the audience, it doesn't exactly need to do so until the genius detective is ready to explain it to us. Stylistically as it can be done, that's basically what it is, just explaining it to us. The problem then in those examples is that it can get a little bit lofty, let's say. These issues are less so in the books because it's easier to write characters thinking in a prose format than it is on TV and film, but either way, murder mysteries are so much about thinking, and when you want your audience to feel like your character is a genius, that character then needs to be thinking at some high level above us, which means their brains need to be quicker than ours, and when their brains are focused on serving a more internal puzzle in their heads rather than something we can see with such obvious action, then the result risks the story getting wrapped up in that lofty show of look how intelligent I am, look how quick I'm thinking, you can't keep up with it. A danger, I suppose, then of falling into style over substance, which I think does increasingly happen with the BBC Sherlock series the more it goes along. As much as I enjoy it, I'm not surprised its quality did start to dip a little, because they kept raising the stakes, I think a little too high and a little too quickly with each new investigation, and that means we need to see Sherlock thinking on more epic levels. We see him pained and under pressure, sure, and he might whisk off to a mind palace, but this is all still basically watching a man think. At what point does that become a bit flat, you know? Not that it's impossible, but it's very hard to convey things like character and chemistry between other characters and sense of threat through just scenes of a man thinking. But some other examples off the top of my head for genius detectives are The Mentalist, if I remember that series rightly, Wyatt in the Bloods. That's one of a clinical psychologist getting very lost in the complex psychology of the killers to the extent you do sometimes get one too many montages of him thinking. House is probably another good example, actually, which isn't strictly murder mystery, but there is definitely a level of solving mystery type feel to that show. With House, it's eccentric genius and his team of doctors all kind of left in his wake most of the time, just as we, the audience, are. Although I've not seen enough of House to judge that fairly, I think I only ever watched about 3 or 4 episodes 8 or 9 years ago, and I was just a bit annoyed by how much the show seems to be, look how great this man is. So that is probably an unfair judgment. I was young at the time, I didn't watch it enough. Shows normally are more so like that in the beginning, just as a means to establish the character, but, you know, I'm throwing it out there anyway. The thing about murder mysteries is that there is always space for it to get too lofty. Having the extreme puzzle of a murder to solve under great pressure can be a very clear thematic setting within which to do all sorts of metaphorical stuff about internal doubts, about facing uncertainty, the pressure of a whole community that may think you're wrong but still having to persevere. Just symbolically, mysteries are all about the unknown, and when we are all so constantly plagued by the unknown in ways that have great emotional effects, you know, from school kids who get crossed in maths lessons and kick off because not being able to solve an equation frustrated them and made them feel stupid, to writers who know there's something they need to drive the character in a certain chapter but can't figure out what, and it makes them doubt their writing ability, to those times in your life when you keep getting really angry and irritable but you don't know why. Those are all kind of the same internal struggle of confronting the unknown and how daunting that is, and in that sense a murder mystery is a great setting to explore all those types of feelings. Just there's always the danger of getting too carried away and having a character of startling intellect grappling with the unknown on such a higher than mortal realm that it becomes a bit dull, I think. And the obvious counter to me saying all of this is that, well, geniuses they might be, but both Sherlock and Poirot and all other geniuses, Rick from Rick and Morty even, are still good characters because they have a clear character flaw to bring them back down to earth. And yeah, I think they are good characters, else they wouldn't have such appeal, but, well, let's consider those character flaws for a moment. Poirot's character flaw really is his obsession with everything being kept in a neat and tidy order. However, I think really I see that more as a quirk that makes him interesting than any genuine flaw that leads to big issues and consequences, something he has to ever confront. And Poirot is arrogant, but again that mostly just boils down to him referring to himself as the great Hercule Poirot rather than opening space for development. Sherlock struggles with drug addiction, which is definitely an interesting addition. However, from what I have read of the books, which isn't too much to be fair, he too is lacking many flaws that lead to consequences. And if we're talking about the BBC adaptation, then his flaw is basically the same as Rex from Rick and Morty. He's insufferable, kind of a rude dick most of the time, but rather than that being something he's really ever challenged over and forced to work through, except in very minor ways, it's mostly just a vehicle for comedy. He gets to say something rude to someone who reacts with a level of shock or offence, and we laugh at them about it. If they do try to challenge the genius, he's either able to outwit them, providing further comedy to laugh at the foolish, offended person, or they're just forced to accept the insufferable nature because, you know... He gets results, you stupid chief!
Dad, sit down.
This insufferable nature becomes just like a natural other side to this coin, which is his genius, and therefore they just have to accept it kind of thing. Which can be a trope I feel gets taken a bit too far. There is definitely some level of wish fulfillment to the idea of getting to be a total dick with almost zero consequences because you're so smart and they need you. Let me talk about another famous detective to hopefully illustrate the opposite, or a famous detective in Britain anyway. Morse from the Inspector Morse series, not so much the prequel Endeavour that kind of went off the rails a little. Chief Inspector Morse is an incredibly clever man of high arts and opera who is very good at solving both crosswords and mysteries. Is he insufferable? Sometimes a bit, yes, but less because he's just a straight dick as a result of his intelligence than that he's a snob about high art, partly I think as a way to distance himself from his humble beginnings, and after getting into Oxford University on a scholarship, a way to kind of beat all the Oxford elite at their own game, but also B, he's a grumpy old man. Whilst grumpy people are often rude, they're not exactly the same thing as straight rudeness. It's not bitter or malicious rudeness with Morse. There's a degree of innocence to it. Morse is also a very empathetic man, never too big to apologise when he does notice his faults, and never beyond awkwardly revealing a little of his vulnerability. More importantly, does his cleverness mean, despite some struggles with thinking, that he largely gets everything right because he's so much more brilliant than everyone else? No. He always needs Lewis's help, and whilst he doesn't always think to praise Lewis for that help, he always values him to the extent he often depends on him. Morse can be very prone to tunnel vision, where, despite his brilliance, he can hold an unfair grudge against a certain suspect and become convinced they're the killer when they sometimes aren't. His grumpiness and snobbish side can lead him astray, as can his painful stubbornness. And he also has a big, worrying tendency to idealise women of culture, in his eyes, any that seem to know poetry and literature and things, and seeing them like figures from opera or great romantic poetry rather than ordinary people. A tendency which often leads his judgments awry in investigations where he seeks to think the best of such women and also makes a mess of his relationships with them quite often. I think this is the crucial point. Morse is a very intelligent man, but because he's human, he's prone to stupidity. He gets things wrong, not getting things wrong in the way Sherlock or Poirot tend to, where they, assume something, later realise their own mistake and have to explain to us and whatever other character, I made a mistake here, how could I be so stupid? It wasn't that the vase was broken, it was that it was never tidied away that matters most. Because in that sort of example, we as the audience don't really see the detective making the mistakes. With Morse, you can clearly see moments where his grudges are making his judgment blinkered. We can spot that long before Morse does. As such, we're more involved and invested. We don't need to be told he's done something stupid, because we've already seen it for ourselves. Our mind can keep up with them. Robbie Coltrane in Cracker is perhaps my favourite example of that, actually. He's a genius clinical psychologist who works to crack cases, but despite all his knowledge and intellect, is so painfully lacking in self-awareness that he consistently self-sabotages his life to the point things pretty much get worse, and he fails to really recognise that or prevent his own sabotage. I find these sorts of characters so much more interesting. They're not perfect geniuses with a flaw there just for the sake of a flaw, but highly intelligent people that can still be humanly stupid as the rest of us. And they have to work with that or else face dire consequences. Not only then are we much less passively sitting back while they kind of reveal everything to us, but we're actively getting to spot their mistakes, and done well, as ordinary as it is, one detective asking questions aloud to their partner, bouncing ideas around in dialogue, I find is so much more engaging than any level of stylistic thinking montages, because in that dialogue you also get character, you get chemistry, sometimes humour between them. Morse's equivalent to Sherlock's Mind Palace is to go to the pub in the middle of the day with Lewis and talk about everything away from the pressure. It works because Morse tends to be a little more open in that environment, reveals hints of his past. You get the humour of all the ways Morse convinces Lewis it's his turn to buy the drinks every time. In those sorts of scenes though, they ask the ordinary important questions that we as the audience can follow, can try to answer, as though we are also involved in this session of bouncing ideas around. It doesn't look as cool, it's certainly not as iconic, but I do find this kind of scene much more fulfilling. So what can we take away from this admittedly haphazard, very minor, pedantic complaint of TV and cinema that I'm making? I don't know. I suppose near-perfect, brilliant genius detectives always have an appeal, not just because it's wish-fulfilling, but because structure-wise, particularly with serialised shows, it's very easy to centre it all around a certain character being great and working like some lone, half mystical figure to drift about fixing problems for everyone else. Which is ultimately what detectives are seen to do, I think. Wander into a new cast of ordinary people each week who are plagued with grief and apparently fix everything for them by finding the murderer. Not that it does fix everything, obviously not, but the conclusion of the episodes gives it the illusion of doing so, which feels very satisfying as an audience. In that sense, there is something very individualistic about genius, brilliant, perfect detectives and shows going, look how great this person is, watch them go about fixing problems for everybody else each week. It feels a bit odd in that sense to idealise this one character and pour all our hopes onto them as the complete hero. And when I think about it in that way, Scooby-Doo is quite an interesting counter. It's nice to see a group of people who all have to chip in, no matter how stupid and clumsy they are. That sometimes actually helps. There's quite a different, nice dynamic to that when I think about it. I've lost the thread of what I was trying to say. I'm just supposing if stories partly tend to provide us with hope in our lives, then a greater sense of hope and therefore emotional investment for us who can relate comes from a more human, flawed character who, despite that, manages to achieve greatness. That feels much more fulfilling than someone already great showing us their greatness and us getting to idealise that. I hope somewhere in this ramble I was making a larger point than just that. Hopefully the comments can help extrapolate it. Either way, like this video if you got something from it, subscribe, support me on Patreon if you want to help keep this channel going, but otherwise, hopefully see you next time.
And as ever, a special thank you goes to Janice McMahon, Luke Hoare, CrzychuKB, Michael Gallagher, In Squares, Dustin Paulson, Brian Herring, Samara Salsi, Sharikoff2814, Joshua C. Follier, Chad Bramwell, and Incomplete Sentience. Thank you.